Hsaio-ting's book, and I found this really cool world map in the 1940s, culturally significant artifact that offers a unique perspective on global geography from a Tibetan viewpoint, published by Gergen Sarchen, the esteemed editor of the Tibet Mirror. This map was printed by the Church of Scotland Guild Mission at the Tibetan Press in Kalimpong. That is a major trade post and very interesting to know. Recently uploaded by someone on Facebook and recommended to me through the algorithm. Okay, Extending Nationalist Influence in Chinese Inner Asia by Dr. Lin Hsaio-ting. The Japanese military expansion in China and other East Asian countries unwittingly offered the beleaguered KMT regime opportunities to increase its authority in Xinjiang, Tibet, and other outlying peripheries in southwest China. More significantly, in order to secure the transport of lend-lease materials from outside world to unoccupied China. So the Japanese were working their way from Manchuria, which is in the northeast, towards the other parts. Chiang Kai-shek took a rather practical stand on the Tibetan issue, as was revealed in his handling of the China-India road issue. On receiving the news that the British had unilaterally persuaded Lhasa to permit a pack route, the majority of the Chongqing officials at first demurred, viewing the British good offices as an affront to their traditional position in Tibet. For example, senior advisors of the Waijiaobu, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, thought that the British might not genuinely be willing to help China and that they were merely concerned about their falling back position in the face of a worsening situation in India. On the other hand, the MTAC officials thought that whether or not the British were indeed trying to help China, they should have first informed the nationalist government before taking any action in Lhasa. Yet before long, the nationalist government decided to adopt a more realistic stance vis-a-vis the pack route issue. In July 1942, the Military Affairs Commission, the top organ of the wartime Chinese government, chaired personally by Chiang Kai-shek, proposed that cooperation with the British over the new pack route via Tibet should be effected without any delay. This body pragmatically suggested that China should not take too seriously the direct contact between Britain and Tibet. For the sake of the development of the supply line as well as the transport of war materials, the Commission further proposed that China should not interfere with the Anglo-Tibetan negotiations and should even allow the British to continue their unilateral diplomatic activities in Lhasa. After the release of this message, Sandesh in Sanskrit, there was a subtle shift in the political climate surrounding China's frontier agenda, and there followed a flurry of pragmatic proposals from Chongqing. In particular, the feasibility of organizing a joint Sino-British transport administration in Tibet was seriously discussed among KMT officials. Interestingly, ideas such as this were no longer regarded as being politically incorrect. It was not necessarily deemed a denial of China's national dignity to be seen cooperating with the British imperialists over the frontier and territorial issues. Chongqing was even ready, albeit quite reluctantly, to accept the British proposal to establish a bureaucratic Indo-Sino-Tibetan Transportation Office manned by Chinese, British, and Tibetan officials who would conduct route affairs. In the summer of 1942, the British mission in Lhasa reported to London that the Chinese representative in Tibet was officially instructed by Chongqing to cooperate and associate with the British in every possible way, quote. Similarly, dispatches from the British Embassy in Chongqing to Whitehall around the same time revealed that the KMT had further instructed their officials in New Delhi and Lhasa to contact the British in order to negotiate a tripartite contract regarding pack route issues. British diplomats both in Chongqing and Lhasa were rather impressed by nationalist China's pragmatic attitude toward its wartime Tibetan agenda. More important, Chongqing's tentative acceptance of such a tripartite arrangement revealed that the nationalist officials were tacitly acknowledging Tibetan independent status outside China's effective political jurisdiction. The KMT leadership's realistic consideration of these issues is significant, since the 1913-14 Shimla Conference, when Yuan Shikai's Republican government in Peking reluctantly accepted the participation of a Tibetan plenipotentiary in this tripartite conference, no Chinese central regime had been willing to consent to any form of public cooperation with the British over issues relating to Tibet. Now, the Sino-Japanese War had left the nationalist government with no choice but to readjust its Tibetan policy for the sake of regime survival. In order to alleviate British suspicion about possible Chinese political and administrative penetration of Tibet, the Waijiaobu did not delay in its attempt to convince London that during this critical period, the only goal of the Chinese was to defeat Japan, and therefore Chongqing possessed no political ambitions toward Tibet. According to Dr. Wellington Koo, this could be Gu Hongming. Okay. China's wartime ambassador to Britain, in late 1942, Chiang Kai-shek had reluctantly agreed not to raise the subject of Hong Kong and Tibet in the course of negotiations for a new Anglo-Chinese treaty in order to secure comprehensive British support for KMT China. Yet behind the pragmatic Chinese standpoint regarding Tibet, Chiang Kai-shek's regime had never really given up hope of seizing any opportunity that the pack route plans might provide to reinforce its authority in Tibet and adjacent areas. For example, while the Chinese agreed to cooperate with the Tibetan authorities in organizing the route service, Chongqing also requested that Chinese technical experts should be stationed along the pack route to supervise transport. The Chinese promised both the Tibetans and British that these technicians would be strictly instructed to confine themselves to transport duties. According to Chinese sources, however, Chongqing dispatches more than mere technical personnel. Using the pretext of security, the nationalist government managed to deploy military and intelligence personnel and KMT party members in newly devised stations along the proposed pack route between Tibet and Sichuan proper. By means of the prospective China-Tibet-India pack route, the KMT nationalists further attempted to bring Tibet proper and the Lhasa-controlled Kham area west of the upper Yangtze River into China's economic and financial orbit. In a detailed investigative report in 1943, a proposal was made to organize a KMT-controlled brick tea company to monopolize the lucrative and voluminous tea business in southwest China. The Tibetans heavily relied on Chinese brick tea as a daily necessity, and Chongqing aimed not only to profit commercially, but also to achieve a better bargaining position in terms of China's Tibetan agenda. A plan was also devised for the Chinese to purchase Tibetan wool. By the late 1930s, raw wool constituted some 90% of the export trade from Tibet to India. But after the onset of war, the British government of India imposed an embargo on the wool trade, which was a heavy blow to the Tibetan economy. The Chongqing officials therefore considered that the purchase of wool and other Tibetan products, which the Sino-Tibetan pack route would facilitate, would hugely strengthen wartime China's economic and commercial links with Tibet. This report further disclosed Chongqing's intention of investing vast capital in Tibetan wool and other traditional businesses as a means of rescuing the worsening Tibetan economy. In return, the Chinese would ask Lhasa's permission to set up KMT agencies in key commercial centers all along the Sino-Tibetan pack route. The Chongqing officials' acceptance of the opening of the Sino-India pack route was consonant with their belated goal of bringing something into circulation in the southwestern peripheries where nationalist financial influence was still weak. I think they mean like currency. It was Chongqing's belief that once its currency, had spread through the Kham region, there would be closer financial ties between unoccupied China and the de facto independent Tibet. Since 1938, with this goal in mind, the nationalist government had endeavored to draw onto its side the well-known Xikang Tibetan Trade Company, 康藏贸易公司. This firm was run by influential Khampa merchants, powerful local headmen, and authoritative lamas in the southwest. The company dealt with various sorts of businesses in an extraordinarily large commercial network ranging from Kokonor to Xikang, Tibet, and the Indian subcontinent. So just a little bit about the present situation right now in North America. We are also witnessing certain conflicts between these groups of the Tibetan diaspora, and they are voicing out their concerns in community town hall style. So if you know Tibetan or if you have Tibetan friends, you can ask them about it in North America, and it's like a cute insight into all the happenings of the past and how it translates into North American context today, since we are talking in North America. These powerful merchants who had commercial headquarters in Kangding, Lhasa, and Calcutta established a number of branches along the traditional Sino-Tibetan commercial routes. The company also possessed a private militia for escorting shipments of goods. By 1943, the possibility of official China-India pack transport further convinced Chongqing leaders of the practical benefit the influential Xikang Tibetan Trade Company could bring to the exchange between the currency of KMT and Tibetan silver coin. KMT policy planners believed that the company could be used to introduce the proposed monetary program, gradually introducing its currency into the Tibetan-dominated Kham area and perhaps into Tibet proper as well, thereby bringing the region under the monetary sway of the KMT. It is clear that the program of building a nationalist state in Kham and even Tibet first appeared simultaneously with the China-India pack route following the Japanese military and economic blockade of China in the early 1940s. With respect to the creation of a nationalist-dominated southwest China, officials in Chongqing had attained a certain degree of success. Strong ties were built between national government and the aforementioned influential Khampa and Tibetan traders when, in 1943, core members of the Xikang Tibetan Trade Company were honorably received in Chongqing. They were given an audience by Chiang Kai-shek, and on the occasion, they also formally gave Chiang their full political allegiance. So this is like when the sheikhs meet in like Iraq, and then they give their support to a certain tribal leader, and then everyone can know the future of the entire region, even though it's rather decentralized. According to one researcher, the currency system never functioned effectively in Sino-Tibetan border areas until the communist takeover in 1949. However, there is no doubt that by the mid-1940s, KMT invested capital in the Xikang Tibetan Trade Company was significant. Toward the end of the war, the lucrative border tea business was no longer a monopoly held by Liu Wilhui and the local non-Han Chinese traders. For the first time since 1928, nationalist commercial and economic influence stretched as far as southwest China, Kham, and Tibet proper. For the purpose of linking Sichuan proper with new international supply lines in Chinese Central Asia, in early 1941, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the construction of several highways in southwest China. By 1942, two important Sichuan-Xikang roads, the first one from Ya'an to Kangding and the second one from Xichang to Leshan via North Yunnan, were nearing completion. So Leshan also has a big Buddha. If you've ever had the chance to visit, it's like really tall and huge, and it's by a river, and the feet is like, 5 times a human height. So then the whole body is like 30 times a human height. Legs, not feet. The whole leg could be like 4 people stacked together, that tall, I think. But yeah, you can look it up, Leshan Buddha. These motorways, particularly the latter one, promised not only to strengthen the defense of Yunnan in the event of attack, but also to relieve some of the Burma road traffic. Transportation facilities in unoccupied China were further enhanced when a third road running from Kangding to Xining was started in 1943 with a view to opening the route to Xinjiang and even as far west as Soviet Russia. Nonetheless, it was the building of 2 other motorways, the Qinghai-Xinjiang route and the Qinghai-Tibet route, Xining to Yushu, that would deserve our attention. The completion of these 2 roads was to be far-reaching significance. was to be of far-reaching significance for the development of nationalist influence in Central Asia. Chiang Kai-shek therefore allocated considerable financial resources to Ma Bufang, who took primary responsibility for their construction. Thousands of local Qinghai Mongolians and Tibetans were mobilized for the task. Ma Bufang's cooperation in constructing these motorways clearly revealed his political ambitions. Apart from seeking to tighten control over his Kokonor domain, Ma also intended to extend his political and military authority into the Gansu corridor and the Altai-Shahar region in southern Xinjiang. Nevertheless, the nationalist government's huge investment reaped considerable rewards. Communications between Sichuan proper and inner Asian territories greatly improved, and the moving of Chinese forces from Kokonor to Tibet and Xinjiang would be much easier than before. By the same token, the realization of these road routes suggested that the advancement of KMT influence into Tibet and Xinjiang now seemed more than a mere fantasy. It is interesting to explore how the British perceived the penetration of the nationalist influence into the Central Asian borderlands. From the British viewpoint, it was an ineluctable trend that Chinese authority would rapidly integrate into eastern Turkestan with the development of Sino-Russo pack routes. Nevertheless, to the British, or more accurately to the government of India, the introduction of Chinese influence into Xinjiang would meanwhile serve to counteract the long-existing Russian domination in this area. Furthermore, as late as 1943, according to the British archives, London still regarded Chiang Kai-shek's regime as less of a threat than the Soviet Russians. The former was less likely to make China Central Asia a base for political infiltration into India. These factors may help to explain why the British showed such great enthusiasm in supporting the Chinese to open new pack routes via Xinjiang and the Pamirs. In addition, as British interests in Xinjiang had been hugely weakened since Sheng Shicai's coming to power in the mid-1930s, the introduction of nationalist influence in Central Asia would help improve the treatment of Indian traders and British diplomats in this region. And any shift of status quo in a communist-dominant Central Asia was surely welcomed by both London and New Delhi. In contrast, the British reaction to the building of the China-Tibet-India route was somewhat paradoxical and vacillating. Upon hearing of the Chinese proposal in 1941, the government of India first showed its lukewarm support for this project. It thought the building of such a roadway, which it felt should be regarded as a long-term program, would not be of particular help to the immediate war effort. In addition, the officials of the government of India thought that if China were to build such a road without Lhasa's consent, Tibet's position as a de facto independent buffer state closely linked to Britain and India would be damaged. In London, the Foreign Office agreed with New Delhi that the China-India roadway was impractical, yet it also felt sympathy for China and sought to assist her struggle against Japan. The British government therefore gave Chongqing its support on the condition that Chongqing obtained Tibetan consent. However, when the Chinese failed to acquire Tibetan consent even to survey the road, it was the British, not the Chinese, who pressured Lhasa to consider the opening of a pack route as an alternate to the China-India motorway to transport Chongqing's needed materials. Despite the British effort, which finally led to China-India pack transport via Tibet, controversy still surrounded this issue. The Chinese insisted that the pack route pass through Lhasa and the Tibetan-controlled stronghold of Chamdo. The British, on the other hand, maintained the view that the route from India to Kangding via South Kokonor, which bypassed Lhasa and the Tibetan-dominated Western Kham area, was the most practical choice. As has already been discussed, the nationalist government did not reject the idea of tripartite co-administration, which would allow the Lhasa authorities to join as a third partner. The KMT high officials were even ready to acknowledge Tibet tacitly by having it participate in the program as a political entity exempt from Chinese sovereign jurisdiction. Yet Chongqing's political gestures failed to reassure both the British and Lhasa authorities that China harbored no ambitions towards Tibet. Moreover, Chiang Kai-shek's attempted involvement in Indian affairs also generated considerable British suspicion. In the face of precarious military situation in East Asia, Chiang considered it a matter of urgency to impress on the Indian Congress leaders the need to fully cooperate in the war effort and, most importantly, to persuade them not to side with the Japanese. From Chongqing's point of view, if conflicts between the government of India and the Indian Congress leaders continued to grow, the Japanese might take advantage of the situation and their influence in the area would inevitably be reinforced. This might cause the nationalist government in southwest China to face a double-edged threat. However, the British did not take kindly to Chiang's approach, which they considered overzealous, in particular the expression of China's greatest sympathy toward the Indian Congress leaders and the Chinese willingness to render mediation to improve the political situation in India. These were considered by the British as unwelcome political interventions in British internal affairs. Some infuriated British Indian officials even proposed that so long as Chiang Kai-shek continued to interfere with Indian affairs, some counteractive measures should be taken toward Tibet, where the Chinese continued to assert their authority. The Tibetan resistance and the Chinese compromise. The examination of the China-India road issue reveals how mutual mistrust during the war caused China and Britain to fail in coordinating action on pack route arrangements in Tibet. The road issue, moreover, reveals how the Tibetans gradually neutralized their political and diplomatic stance in the face of the Second World War. Since the beginning of the reign of the 13th Dalai Lama, His Holiness, the goal of building a modernized Tibet had contributed to a close relationship between Lhasa and the British. Yet, although there was mutual suspicion and sometimes even intermittent armed border conflicts between Republican China and Tibet, interactions between the two nations had never really been suspended. Both of the two high-profile missions, led respectively by Huang Musong in 1934 and Wu Zhongxing in 1940, for instance, were well received by the Tibetans. Even at the initial stages of the Sino-Japanese War, the Tibetans still gave their blessings to Chongqing in the hope of a final victory for the Chinese side. Nevertheless, in the early 1940s, when the war in the Chinese and Southeast Asian theater was unfavorable to the Allied powers, Lhasa's attitudes subtly switched, and it sought instead to maintain a kind of neutrality, if not closed-door policy, when dealing with external affairs. This shifting policy was best exemplified by the China-India road issue. As mentioned previously, with the threat of the roadway running through their territory, the Tibetans resolutely rejected any attempt on the part of the Chinese to extend their influence into the region. Yet the Tibetans were hostile not only toward the Chinese, but also toward the British. A recent biographical study suggests that by 1942, a lot of Tibetan high officials genuinely believed that the Axis powers would eventually defeat the Allies and that Japan would finally conquer the whole of China. In response to the British pack route proposal, Lhasa officials worried that their country might thereafter be involved in war and that other powers may take advantage of the situation to the detriment of the peace of Tibet. The Tibetan refusal of the pack route project deeply disappointed the government of India, and the British continued to exert pressure on Lhasa. Only when London eventually threatened to impose political and economic sanctions on the Tibetans did the Lhasa authorities finally give in. However, after the summer of 1942, when the Tibetans officially accepted the pack route transport for the first time, their resistance to any possible influx of Chinese influence was as steadfast as ever. Lhasa's determination was demonstrated when it firmly rejected the dispatch of Chinese technical experts along the route to supervise the work. In November 1942, when the Chinese realized that the Tibetans would not allow the posting of any nationalist officials on the route, Chongqing compromised by contracting private Tibetan transport firms as a way to depoliticize the route issue and appease Lhasa. The British agreed to this arrangement and continued in their attempts to persuade Lhasa to come to terms with the Chinese. However, the Tibetans responded by forbidding any private Tibetan trade firms to contact the Chinese without Lhasa's consent. In 1943 January, the Chongqing officials were further informed by Lhasa that no permission would be granted for shipments through Tibet unless a tripartite agreement with Britain was signed. The Chinese officials did not actually reject such a tripartite disposition, and the KMT regime's tolerance and willingness to compromise was further demonstrated when, in July 1942, the Tibetan government suddenly announced the creation of a Foreign Affairs Bureau to deal with Tibet's external affairs. Chiang Kai-shek's government deliberately ignored the appearance of this strikingly symbolic organization that would represent Tibet's sovereign status for fear of jeopardizing the pack route. Yet even as late as March 1943, almost 9 months after Lhasa had consented to the transport of non-military goods via Tibet, there was still no China-Britain-Tibet tripartite agreement for the transport of war materials needed by the Chinese. The Tibetan government had even taken the rather rash step of ordering all Tibetan firms to stop the shipment of all goods, including non-military ones, to China, a move that deeply infuriated Chiang Kai-shek. By May 1943, Chiang was so angry about Lhasa's uncooperative manner that he personally summoned the Tibetan representative in Chongqing, Nawang Gyaltsen, in order to reproach him. The possible threat of all-out Japanese activity in Upper Burma, North India, and the adjacent Himalayan areas, along with Tibet's negative attitude concerning the pack route, caused the nationalist government to gradually lose patience. Relations between China and Tibet became so tense that in the spring of 1943, news was rife in both the media and diplomatic circles that Chinese forces were being mobilized and moved toward the Sino-Tibetan border. The alarmed Tibetans were alleged to have sent their troops to South Kokonor to guard against any possible Chinese invasion. While the Chinese and Tibetans accused each other of threats of aggression, Chiang Kai-shek privately assured the Allied leaders that his country would not resort to force to invade Tibet, and any movement of troops would be for the purpose of China's quote-unquote self-defense. In addition, Chiang Kai-shek's orders to the warlords to move their troops to the Tibetan borders were ostensibly intended to overawe the obstinate Tibetans. However, there was also an underlying hope of top KMT officials that Chongqing might be able to use this opportunity to send forces directly under Chiang's command into the border provinces on the pretext of providing reinforcements. The movement of Chinese troops into Tibet, portrayed in contemporary literature as the best evidence of the Chinese intention to use military means to solve the Tibetan issue, merits closer examination. As early as mid-1942, when confidential reports were submitted to the Chongqing leaders about the growing danger of Japanese encroachment in South Tibet and North India, both Liu Wenhui in Xikang and Ma Bufang in Qinghai had been instructed to move their troops to the Sino-Tibetan borders. According to Chinese sources, Ma Bufang immediately followed Chiang Kai-shek's instructions and moved his Muslim cavalry toward the border. On the other hand, Liu Wenhui, who greatly suspected Chiang's motive, tentatively agreed to mobilize his forces so long as Chongqing was willing to offer him more military resources. Yet the placement of troops on the Sino-Tibetan borders was a reflection of how Chiang Kai-shek's military planners and security advisors conceptualized their regime's survival and national defense at this particular moment during the war. As they saw it, once India or Tibet fell under Japanese control, the whole interior of China, including Sichuan proper, would be exposed to direct Japanese threat. In other words, instead of attempting to launch an attack on Tibet, Chongqing was forming a military barrier on the Xikang Tibetan and Qinghai Tibetan borders. This was revealed in Chiang Kai-shek's confidential dispatch of October 1942 to General Xu Yongchang, then the Nationalist Minister of Military Ordnance. Chiang's telegram to Xu shows his full understanding of Chongqing's difficulty in mobilizing border troops that were still under the warlord's command. He also thought it equally impractical to use the Chinese troops stationed in the Indian theater to attack Tibet because this would be totally unacceptable to the United States and Britain. Nevertheless, Chiang pointed out that this might change if the situation suddenly shifted in the Burma or India theaters. Clearly, Chiang Kai-shek only considered that it might be necessary to use force toward Tibet if this region happened to be under Japanese control, and thus was a threat to the safety of southwest China. Implicitly, therefore, Chiang Kai-shek was viewing Tibet as a buffer zone, which the Chinese could use to keep out any Japanese military infiltration arriving from a politically unstable India or a militarily vulnerable Tibet. Oh gosh, sounds like 2025. According to source materials now open to us, both the American and British governments were generally convinced that reports claiming Tibetans were being instigated by the Japanese and that they were planning offensive action against Chinese border provinces were exaggerated. Nevertheless, in their internal analyses, high authorities of Washington and London could not entirely rule out the existence of a Japanese presence in the Lamaist kingdom and its possible threat to the war-besieged China. In his dispatch to Whitehall, British Ambassador Sir Horace Seymour reported that there were indeed unconfirmed stories indicating that the Japanese were sending munitions of war to the Tibetans who were preparing the airfields in the Kham district for Japanese aircraft. In another confidential telegram from New Delhi to London, officials of the government of India grudgingly admitted that Japanese monks were likely to have been penetrating Tibetan monasteries. When learning that MPs in the British House of Commons were interested in knowing more about the alleged Axis movements in the Lamaist land, officials in New Delhi were so anxious to keep the spotlight off Tibet that they went as far as urging Whitehall to have MPs' questions withdrawn. The U.S. Embassy in Chongqing also suggested that there was some basis for believing in the presence of a few Japanese secret agents in Tibet, although the Americans were inclined to believe that the alleged Japanese activity and Tibetan aggressiveness in southwest China were overstated. It is also worth noting that the Chinese mission in Tibet did not really believe that there was a large number of Japanese in Lhasa. However, Chinese officials in Lhasa were convinced that a considerable number of Mongolians or Tibetans who could easily cross the boundary from Gansu and Qinghai were already working as spies for the Japanese. Regardless of the perceptions of the intricate wartime frontier scenario, tension on the Sino-Tibetan border had somewhat diminished toward the end of 1943, and both the Chinese and Tibetans were willing to compromise to a certain degree. The Lhasa officials no longer refused the Chinese permission to carry goods across their territory. Neither did they decline the entry of Chinese technical experts or other personnel once they were registered under Tibetan trade firms. Chongqing, in return, expressed its goodwill by withdrawing its representatives in Lhasa who had fallen afoul of the Tibetans and replacing him with a new representative who was a close ally of Chiang Kai-shek. This was a gesture designed to show the improvement in China's relations with Tibet. The nationalist officials also continued to implement their policy of privatizing pack route affairs, and they reduced to a minimum any political actions in order to realize trans-Tibet transport. A new firm, joined by the aforementioned prominent Khampa Tibetan merchants and shareholders, and backed by full KMT support, was set up in November 1943 in Kangding. Predictably, via the firm, Chinese influence rapidly extended into Kham and Tibet proper, and all the way through the northern Indian cities such as Calcutta and Kalimpong. The best example of the growing Chinese influence was the opening of a new branch of the Bank of China in Kalimpong to facilitate Chinese commercial and economic activities brought with the pack route. There was also serious discussion in Chongqing about the possibility of opening another branch headquarters of the Bank of China in Lhasa. Another event that demonstrates the nationalist influence into Sino-Tibetan border areas is the completion of the survey work for the originally proposed China-India motorway in early 1944. Despite previous objections by Tibetans, Chongqing sent a second survey team to the Sino-Tibetan border. This time, Chinese officials did not encounter much Tibetan resistance. The survey group, masquerading as merchants departed from Kunming, entered Lhasa administered tribal areas in the Assam Tibetan borderlands and finally reached their destination in Sadia. The nationalist government's clandestine survey activities were in accordance with the statements made by Hsaio-ting Lin, the newly appointed Chinese representative to Tibet. He expressed the desirability of fixing an eastern boundary for Tibet and of opening a motor road between India and China via Tibet. Although Shen apparently put his road project in the interest of Sino-Tibetan communications, both the British and the Tibetans were convinced that the opening of previously proposed communications with Tibet from the Chinese side would promote opportunities for Chinese economic and political penetration in the area. The reopening of overland communications after 2 years and 8 months of Japanese blockade between China Kunming, India Lidu via Burma in early 1945 received tremendous publicity and provided a strong stimulus to Chinese public morale. Chinese sources suggest that instead of utilizing the proposed China-India roadway for wartime material supplies, the KMT regime was now considering this route to be of strategic significance in consolidating its state control in southwest China. Moreover, having the completed survey for the road via Tibet, the nationalists sought to strengthen their bargaining position vis-a-vis an unpredictable Sino-Tibetan relationship in the post-war era. Nevertheless, at no time before the collapse of its rule in 1949 did the nationalist government have an opportunity to begin the road through the Tibetan-controlled areas. In the late 1950s, it was Chiang Kai-shek's long-term adversary, the Chinese Communist Party, that eventually realized the long-awaited Sino-Tibetan roadway project. And then there's the conclusion. You guys can read it if you support the publication and buy the book. Thank you so much for listening. That was Lin Hsaio-ting's book.